think the question is a fascinating one. Kind of where are we? Where are we relative to specific marginalized communities? Where are we relative to our community? I think we have made a ton of progress, but we have a long, long way to go. And I say this working at a company that has made a lot of progress, but still has a long, long way to go. Part of the reason I got into tech, and Uber specifically, I spent a couple of years at Google before I came to Uber, is because I recognized the degree to which historically we have been left behind. We have been marginalized when innovations come along. Sometimes we are actually the people who build those innovations. We took a train here today. We were oftentimes the people who built those railroads, but we did not get any of the credit, any of the returns, any of the ownership in that work. And so I think we have clearly seen the degree to which, as consumers, to Nicole's initial point, we have benefited. I got into sort of the space at Uber because I remember what it was like to not be able to get a cab.
That's right.
In this city, in DC, didn't matter where you were going, it didn't matter what you looked like. Sometimes, they would actually ask you, are you going to this place? And they would drive away when you said you were going to a place that they didn't want to go. So I feel a sense of pride because my company has helped change that outcome. But to that more macro point, we still have a lot of work to do. I think about how I can build access into the work that my company is doing from the perspectives of sort of physical barriers to entry, geographic barriers to entry, and financial barriers to entry. And we've made some progress on some of those areas, but there's still a lot of work that we need to do to make sure that Uber is truly accessible to as many people as possible. And so I think as consumers, we are more empowered than we've ever been, and we are more engaged in so many of these platforms in a way that gives us a voice, that gives us a platform in and of itself to speak out and be empowered. But we have so much more work to do to make sure that we are just not consumers, but we are owners, and we are actually decision makers in making sure that we are just not represented at these companies, but that ultimately we are creating outcomes with the products that we're creating that are going to be beneficial for our community. So we're in the middle of the road towards where we need to be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Malcolm. How about you, Nilda?
So I just jotted down a few things because I had thought about this question, but I was really thinking about this question on the train ride up. And when I think about the state of telecom and tech right now, I think it's 100% exploding. It's growing in ways that we never imagined. I think privacy is going to be central to innovation. Mm-hmm. It's really the focus of why things are being innovated at this point, why things are working and why some things are not working. Video has changed everything. And the Internet of Things has done so much for us, for the explosion of broadband speeds, broadband availability, Wi-Fi, all of those things, all of the devices that we have. I think they say the average, there's a study, the average is like 8.5 connected devices each person has. And in the next few years, it'll be like 13.5 something devices.
Are these real people?
They're real people. I mean, I think about how many devices are in my home alone that are connected to my Wi-Fi router. I have my Bose headphones, I've got my phones, I've got my tablet, I've got my laptop, I've got, an iPod, I've got lots of things, right? And that's one person. Mm-hmm. So I think about the state of telecom and tech, and I think it feels to me like there's no limit to what's in the possible. Is it all good? Probably not. Are there sectors of this economy where communities of color are being left behind? Absolutely, 100%. But that's not to say that I don't think there are things that are being done to change sort of that model. But I think everything that we knew traditionally is gone away. You can think about all of the companies that you thought would be around forever. They are no more. Look at what Netflix did to Blockbuster. But look at what Netflix is doing to HBO. Look at what Amazon blew up the whole thing. They were just selling books. Now Amazon is like New York City online. If you go to Amazon and it's not there, it doesn't exist. I'm 100% convinced. If you can dream it and you type it in, somebody is selling that product. And now they're doing groceries, they're doing deliveries, they're doing movies, they've got content. I mean, so I think tech and telecom as we know it, it's really about the economy. And I think it's central and it's key to how we're growing. It's why our, the next generation is either really smart or they're going to be really dumb. And they will have no social skills, or they'll have a lot of social skills, or they'll know how to make money, or they won't know how to make money in this economy. So I think the state of telecom and tech is endless at this point. But I think it makes jobs like, companies like Uber have to, even though they were innovative, they have to stay 50 times ahead of the game, because that model is going to be obsolete in a minute, right? Because people are coming up with new ways, new things. And I think that's what Silicon Harlem is really looking at, and probably that was my segue.
I was going to say, thank you, Nilda.
Yeah, that was cool.
So, Bruce, it's up to you. State of telecom and tech.
So this is great to be here and be a part of Rainbow Push and having a chance to speak to such an engaged audience. My name is Bruce Lincoln. I'm the co-founder of Silicon Harlem. Myself and my partner, Clayton Banks, founded this company, and we're a for-profit company 5 years ago with the express idea to ensure that underserved communities, those communities that have historically been underserved by the tech industry, were involved in the digital economy. And just sort of to frame what will, I think, serve as a context for my remarks, I think we're at an important point, and it's an inflection point in technology. And what we see as the internet advances, in support of what Malcolm has said or what Nilda has said, but with a different filter placed upon it, is we're at an inflection point where the next generation internet will be the community internet. And I mean this to say, as these technologies are advancing, what's starting to happen just from the physical architecture of the internet itself, as we have driverless cars and the Internet of Things, is that this next internet is going to be in the community, physically located on rooftops, based on this idea of small cell densification, in basements, based on what we're looking to do with edge cloud servers. And what this is driven by is the fact that not only are there more things going to be on the internet, there are going to be smart cities that have this level of connectivity, but all of us, as Nicol alluded to, we have these mobile devices. And ultimately, this is where all your activity will be happening, where you will need to be mobile, where you will be calling that driverless car that will now potentially pick you up. And we want to see that happen not only downtown, we want to see that happen on 135th Street. So communities like Harlem are actually some of the testing grounds for these new technologies, because this new infrastructure has to be connected to us. So a lot of the fact that we serve as the first adopters and love devices is now being looked at from the standpoint of how these technologies are being deployed. And we're currently involved with 3 major initiatives funded by the National Science Foundation, which over the next 3 years will push the next generation internet. But what was interesting about these particular grant programs is they had explicitly designated community involvement. So that's very different from this thing residing at a top flight research university and then being spun out into the private sector. This is beginning in the local community, where you're looking at all those kind of sociological, culturological elements that will go into the adoption of, say, the 10G, such as what Nilda's talking about coming through the cable companies, or the next generation of driverless cars. So I'll end my initial remarks with that.
No, this is all interesting. I think what we've heard, is just I could paraphrase for those of us that have been listening, is that the technology train has left the station, right? It's actually happened. The innovation that we're actually seeing come out of Uber. I mean, how many of you in here use ride-sharing services? Right? Digital sharing economy combined with the general digital economy makes up 6.2% of the GDP now, right? Which means that those industries are sort of supplanting and replacing, as Nilda has indicated, some legacy industries. Amazon is a good example of that. I was looking for Fashion Fair cosmetics, and I can get it on Amazon. I can't get it in the store no more. No, I'm dating myself, right? But
That
Amazon
should
does
not
sell
be
it.
available.
But they still sell it, right? It's the truth in terms of where we're evolving with new tech. But as Bruce said, we want it to be in downtown and uptown. So there are places that we do not want to be either redlined or have that technology not accessible because of the cost and benefit that it allows. So Malcolm, I want to go back to you for just a second then when we look at Uber and we look at the sharing economy and the growth of these industries. I mean, this happened overnight. You know, I can't tell you how many Uber line items I see on my credit card bill. And I was thinking, was I doing this before or was I walking? Right? Like, what happened?
You were doing this.
I
and
was.
then you were looking for cash.
And then they weren't
to pay a taxi
That's what it
because
was.
they didn't take credit cards, at least in DC.
And Black when we had a hard time too. They wasn't picking us up. Maybe that's why my bill was cheaper, right, when it came to car services. But let me ask you a question in terms of the growth of this economy. Bruce sort of indicated we're going to connected cars or autonomous vehicles, as some may say, but it's driverless. Are we going to see more in this ride-sharing economy in terms of its evolution, less, or are we going to see, what are we going to see going forward?
I think Bruce made a really good point about this combination of sort of the digital and the physical. That the internet is going to live and breathe and be with us in a way that it has not historically been. Oftentimes I think we think of the internet as something with which we interface on a screen, but the reality is the internet is increasingly becoming a part of our physical lives. And I think we feel that quite saliently at a company like Uber because ultimately we're using a digital platform to facilitate this real world engagement or interaction every single day between two strangers in a 2,000-ton vehicle traveling at very high speeds. So lots of variables that we have to take into account that are not just sort of digital variables. But I think to your point, Nicole, as time goes on, there will certainly be increases and growth of our industry. I just think about our business. The way that people think about Uber historically is you press a button and a car comes, you get in the car and you go where you need to go. That's part of it. And so UberX is the core part of what we do, but Uber Pool, where you share a ride with someone and get a decrease in the fare, is 20% of our rides in places where it exists. I think about something that we've invested heavily in and is a very important part of what my job is, and that's accessibility for people with disabilities. I think we sometimes forget the overlap between the disability population and our community, and the reality that if you're Black or brown, you are more likely to be a person with a disability than if you are white. And what does that mean practically? It's not just about getting access to service, but it's about all of the longer tail impacts of getting access to that service. And so we've invested heavily in building out a wheelchair accessible vehicle platform that covers right now about half of the places where trips take place in the US and Canada on the Uber platform. And that's great in a vacuum, but what does that mean practically? Well, if you are a person with a disability, you are more likely to miss your medical appointment. If you miss your medical appointment, you are less likely to get a refill on your prescription drugs. If you don't get a refill on your prescription drugs, that starts to have a meaningful impact on all different sorts of qualities of life for a group that is disproportionately Black and brown. And so I am really excited that someone at a panel that I'm a part of brought up redlining before me, because that is super rare. And I think it's indicative of Nicole's thoughtfulness on this issue and the community that we have in front of us. But we have to think about access in all sorts of ways. So in terms of geography, where you live, but also, are you a person who needs additional help in order to access this platform? And if so, what can we do to do that? And if we do that, what long tail impact does that have on your life? There was a study that Harvard conducted in 2015 that said that the greatest determining factor to whether a family in poverty can actually remove themselves from poverty is not access to schools, it's not crime rate in their neighborhood, it's actually commute time. And so this question of access to, and this is just transportation, there are a whole host of issues, and Amazon's a part of a lot of them, in which this is really meaningful as well. But just if you're just talking about transportation, that impact on so many communities, many of whom include people like us, is super, super meaningful. And so we are thinking about this in every single way. The platform we have today, building out Pool, building out wheelchair accessible vehicles, increasingly building out new mobility options like bikes and scooters. I think a lot of people have seen the proliferation of the city bikes in New York. We have Capital Bike Share in DC. But if you look at a map of where that bike infrastructure exists, it is very heavily disproportionately focused in places that already have very robust bike lanes, where people already have access to large number of biking options, and not in the places where people need a bike option, and particularly where there is a low-cost transit alternative in a place that might not be well served by transit that can be a bike. And so we're very excited about the notion of a dockless system that can actually put bikes in all parts of a city at the very beginning of every single day to make sure that that equitable entity is a part of every single place in which we operate. So I think the long term is, you'll be able to pull up the Uber app and you'll be able to get access to a car like you are today. You'll be able to get access to a bike or a scooter if that makes the most sense for you, a wheelchair accessible vehicle, and then certainly in the future, perhaps an autonomous vehicle, and then thinking real long term, we're investing in things like Uber Elevate, which is the opportunity to take a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft from point to point. Wow. Notwithstanding things like inner engagement with transit, which we just launched in Denver, Colorado. And so in the same way that a company like Amazon is a platform, I think the long-term vision for Uber is a platform as well, but a platform that has equity and accessibility kind of at the core of everything that we're doing.
Now, Nilda, I want to run to you, and then I want to come back to Bruce to talk about how we actually engage in ownership opportunities around this stuff. Cable went through the same thing in video, right? Your networks had to start streaming. Can you speak a little bit about, this multi-platform world that we also live on video? Because I would say ride sharing is one part of the state of tech and telecom, but video is another part of it, particularly streaming, right? And how has the cable industry also adjusted to what that looks like as well?
Well, I mean, I think the cable industry had to get honest with themselves, right? Which is the video platform. I mean, content is still king, but content is expensive. But when we really developed our core internet service business, that became everything. So we weren't producing content necessarily, right? A whole ton of it. I mean, you had the HBOs of the world, but as a cable provider, we were providing the infrastructure by which all of this could be viewed. So I think once cable operators understood fully, like Uber and others, that you had to change or get eaten. I mean, you had to do something that was going to make your business something that people wanted to have. And the streaming and the making your content available everywhere, that had to happen because people were going elsewhere to get it. So if you could find a way to stay connected to your customer, and your customer could have brand loyalty, right? So we developed Wi-Fi hotspots where cable operators were starting to make arrangements with other cable operators who were situated geographically in other parts of the country to provide crossover authentication for Wi-Fi. So if I live in Florida and I'm a Charter customer, but I come to New York City, and before it was Charter, when it was like Cablevision, we had an agreement. I could get onto a Cablevision Wi-Fi hotspot just by authenticating because they had an agreement. At that time, we had, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago, we had over 250,000 Wi-Fi hotspots, right? It's to help dump traffic off the network, give people an opportunity to be able to do, as Bruce was saying, things with your phone in the community. You could sit in a park and do certain things. So I think that it really was about making your content available everywhere so that people had loyalty to you as a customer. And really the programmers wanted their programming to be seen by more eyeballs. I mean, if you didn't subscribe to HBO, but you had a cable subscription, you missed Game of Thrones. And the popularity of a show like Game of Thrones, guess what? HBO figured out, wait, we can monetize this more ways, more times. What about those kids that go off to college that no longer have their parents' subscription to cable, but they still want to watch Game of Thrones? Boom, $15. You do that times 1 million consumers, you got something. You got content that's now being multiplied times however many. Advertising gets built into that. All of the things that you can do from just one hit show.
That's right.
So I think it's about reinventing yourself. And in business, you either buy or get bought. That's what's happening to companies now. You got to get bigger to stay relevant.
That's right. Well, and I want to say, too, before I go over to Bruce, in terms of opportunities for people of color, I think that's why we hear a lot of conversation around having broadband networks that are faster, because the supply side of it, and I was just in a conversation with this, it's really not our issue. We've heard already the ride-sharing economy is growing, content is king, and people want it wherever, whatever device, you know, at whatever time. It's what Bruce talked about, whether or not we have 5G, 10G, 6G, whatever the G may be. The networks have to be built to support the type of consumer demand. And I think that's something that's also the state of telecom and tech. How do you build robust networks, particularly within communities of color, where we could actually take advantage of all this stuff? And that's why I am quick to bring up redlining, because we should have the same type of flowers potted in our communities as other people have in theirs to be able to benefit from all these things. But Bruce, I want to turn to you, and then I've got a digital divide question, and then again, if you have questions, I want you to hold that. I got one more question for moderator privilege, and then we're going to open it up real quick. Bruce, are we owning any of this stuff? Statistics tells us that the venture capital funds that go to black startups, women startups, is significantly lower when it comes to businesses of color. You started Silicon Harlem because people didn't think in Silicon Valley there were enough people of color to actually do that, so we had to bring it to where we are. Entrepreneurs are creating content as the lowest hanging fruit, right? We're actually seeing people like Issa Rae get picked up by the HBOs now, which we haven't seen in a long time. What is it that we need to be thinking about when it comes to ownership and participation in this space as people of color?
So I'll talk about it in two ways, because there's what we're doing immediately, and not that we're doing it alone. We're doing it from the standpoint of creating an ecosystem. So what we saw that happened in Silicon Alley and in Digital Dumbo was that it wasn't just the one company, it was multiple companies and all the supportive services that would make it possible for companies to grow and flourish. So that's what we've worked to create in Harlem. Now, how we began was as a meetup. And in fact, it was February 26th of 2013, we had the first Silicon Harlem meetup, and it was myself and my partner. You know, we're both geeks, and we were tired of going to meetups downtown, so we had a technological space uptown, as was actually black-owned. It wasn't quite a co-working space, but it had high-speed internet connectivity, it had a cafe, it had a bar, it had theaters, and we had a meetup, and 500 people showed up. So we realized that there was a market and a demand for this. And we grew the meetup to where by our fourth month, we both got recognized by our local elected officials and by Google. So it was that type of activity that started to attract the sort of resource and the attention. We've since grown where we've brought a WeWork up to Harlem and have populated with 50 companies. What's missing is really attracting the venture capital to these level of entrepreneurs. We do have entrepreneurs who have venture capital funding, but it's not as if it's being funded in the same way that you see it happening in a Silicon Alley or in a Silicon Valley. But we were able to, in what is in essence quite a short period of time, get to where we are now. We have attracted, through the National Science Foundation, over the next 5 years, $50 million. So that will basically support the development of the next generation internet, and then out of that we'll have the opportunity to spin off these technologies and grow new entrepreneurial based companies. But we took advantage of, one, the population of Harlem, and as it was changing, so we are definitely a diverse and a consciously diverse population, but we've taken advantage of the support of a Columbia University, where I'm also a senior fellow at the B School. We've connected it back to City College. We've also brought in NYU, Rutgers. So it's this very diverse ecosystem to support this as it grows. The next thing is to really build a true tech talent pipeline so that the schools in School District 5 and School District 4 and School District 6 are starting to get the type of STEM programming that will then really create the opportunity to plug into the job. So there's still that type of gap as far as skilled workers to take these jobs. But what you're starting to see is the community is producing the kind of coding classes. So we're doing that at our local universities and schools. We have STEM entrepreneurship programs in the middle and the high schools. So it's starting to be this full-blown, if you will, ecosystem, which is starting to, on the policy side, help the city think about how to further grow this, but also think about what is an inclusive smart cities policy. So those are all the different disparate parts that have to be brought together. So what you have is the kind of launch pad that can then give rise to those entrepreneurs who will then really attract capital or even attract the customer base. We've done a lot of this based on the sort of lean startup methodology, where if you're developing a product or a service that's worthwhile, you should also be able to develop early on a set of customers. So the companies that we nurture, we really help them connect to customers as well, so that we can then get them to where they can attract venture capital funding or some level of investment funding.
No, that's actually an interesting point. We're going to go to questions. I just have one last question I want to actually throw out to this panel, and then we'll go to a question, and I'll keep asking if there's no other questions. So Bruce talked about the issues of disparities when it comes to venture capital to actually create this ecology in our communities, and I think he's right on point that we have to sort of bring this drive to actually find capital. But one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is the digital divide. And I think we'd be something that we do need to talk about here when it comes to level of access. Shameless plug, I have a book coming out on this in 2020. Digital Invisibility, How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. Please buy it. Hopefully I'll be invited back to actually talk about it, John. But I bring that out. On the one hand, your age, your race, your residence, whether you're rural or urban, foreign-born, disability, that all impacts the 11 million people who are not online today. And they've consistently not been online. That's one issue. Nilda sort of mentioned another issue that keeps people offline is their fear of their privacy being compromised. I want you to talk about that. Malcolm, you got to have a credit card to do Uber. Financial collateral. Poor people, in particular low-income people, tend to be underbanked. How do they take advantage of this? And finally, Bruce, I'll hit this with you with digital disparities. You mentioned it a little bit in terms of pipeline. Our kids still go to schools where they're not even placing tech as a priority. They're telling the kids to shut off the phone so they can focus on the book.
They lock them up.
Or they're being incarcerated, their early pipeline to the prison.
And then they lock their phones up.
Oh, I was there. Well, that too. But I'm saying, I've heard teachers.
That's another conference.
That's a whole other conference. Look, I'm channeling Reverend Jackson for a second, right? But some schools tell the kids turn off the phone. And those kids don't have laptops or tablets to actually work from. So I want to deal with those disparities. I think I got the one settled, and I think everybody can agree with me because I'm right about it, that we still have the demographic disparities that you'll read about in my book. But I want to talk about the privacy first. I want to talk financial collateral, and then I want to talk about what are we going to do to get our schools to close this homework gap. Talk about privacy.
Well, real quick, because I know we're under time here, but look, if I take my association hat off, I think we all have to ask the question, how much privacy do you, what's your expectation of privacy? Let's put it that way. I think you have to ask yourself that question. It stops me from going to certain sites. It stops me from doing certain things. I still have a profile on Facebook and Instagram, but I have cut it off. I don't feel like it. I just don't want people to know where I am all the time. So those are things, but I think with, if you look at some of the services that we use, not to pick on any search engine over another, but even the apps that we use, you have to give certain permissions to be able to use the full capabilities of those applications. It's not your social security number that they want. They want the connections between you and someone else. This is how artificial intelligence happens. When you start getting that Starbucks ad at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it's because they know at 3 o'clock in the afternoon that you start to just kind of tool around on the internet. You're a little bored. And then these ads are popping up, and you didn't think about Starbucks until you saw it. And then next thing you know, you're up out of your seat and you're over at Starbucks. But they also want to know that when you go to Starbucks and you scan, bloop, and then it says, oh, she bought a cookie. What day of the month is, a lot of things happen. So all of those connections matter. But I think we as a community, we as users of the internet ecosystem and all of the like have to really demand our basic level of expectation and privacy as we move about on these platforms.
You think Congress will come up with privacy legislation?
Yes. Now, will it look like, it'll look something like the healthcare like Obamacare. You'll get the best of some of what you want, and then other parts will be horrible. Because I think the problem with trying to legislate something that has no boundaries, it's just that, it has no boundaries. We're trying to legislate on what we don't even know to be the premise 10 years from now. We don't know.
Malcolm, you can't use Uber without a financial collateral. How do we resolve that with, what's your company thinking about when we look at the underbanked and unbanked who actually sit on the other side of the digital divide?
So you can't do that in this country.
Yes.
But one of the things that I've started to do in the last couple of months is really think about questions of accessibility in underserved communities from a global perspective. And so we have, in a number of markets, particularly places like India and a number of places in Latin America, launched a cash option. And so in India, for example, more than half of our rides are actually paid in cash. And one of the things that we've realized is it massively opens up access to the platform. Now, one of the realities that we've also grappled with, particularly in some of the places in Latin America, is that it also creates something of a target for drivers. Because one of the things that drivers told us from the very beginning was, I love Uber because there's no cash, and I'm not a target when I'm carrying around a bunch of money when this isn't a part of the equation. So there is a little bit of a tension. I don't think you have to choose between access and safety in some respects. I tend to fall on the side of access as the most important core competency that we need to be focused on as we build out our platform. But there is a recognition that as we continue to see what cash looks like elsewhere, there's a roadmap to bring cash to the United States. And the one additional thing I would say is we're also thinking about limited smartphone infrastructure. So if you have perhaps a smartphone, but not a smartphone that can deal with robust amounts of data, or you pay by the megabyte and you don't have an unlimited plan, and this is particularly the case in lower income areas. And so we've introduced a product called Uber Lite in a number of different places around the world, which has a 5 megabyte download footprint, and sort of removes a lot of the bells and whistles that aren't necessary for the core of the ride experience, to allow people to connect with drivers when they don't have fairly robust smartphone infrastructure. Again, that's something we piloted in a couple places around the world. We launched it in the Middle East. We're seeing really good results there, and I wouldn't be surprised if in the future we bring it here too.
No, that's all interesting too. And I think with the growth of fintech, like the Cash App and stuff, we may actually see more connections between these two digital economies. Bruce, before we go to questions, how do we close the homework gap? Because you can't learn it if you don't have it.
That is, well, actually, in New York City, those who don't have access to the internet, don't have access to broadband, is as high in some communities as 40%. And then where we were last Wednesday, in East Harlem, it's as high as 50%. And what you see, it's as Nicole said, young people standing by Starbucks or McDonald's with their phone to try to get a Wi-Fi signal. And so part of how we're trying to address it here in the city of New York is through our Link NYC program, where what we've done is put gigabit speed wireless kiosks all over the city. But once again, they're not all over the city. They are actually more in Harlem per capita because we advocated on that behalf. But what it sort of leads to is there has to be an outcry from the community. Community really has to come together and push for these things and deal with it from a standpoint as a necessity, not as a luxury. Because if you don't have access to the internet, you don't have access to this economy that is growing by leaps and bounds. So we've got to try to upgrade the infrastructure in the schools. We have to try to advance high-speed wireless, but we also have to have computer science for all and STEM literacy in all the schools. And I was saying we have it in a certain set of schools, but when you get up to Community School District 5 and 6 and 4, you don't find those same programs. What you also don't find are the teachers who are getting the same level of professional teacher development that can help them use those, not necessarily the technologies, but the relevant educational applications that are so important for the young people to have. And then just to intersect this with education, as a pioneer in digital education going back 30 years, myself and my colleagues look around and we now go, wow, it's so important that we make sure as well that young people really read books and understand how to comprehend and deal with literature. It's more important than ever because you can't get all of your information over social media, because most social media really has no authority and it is without context. And so if you don't understand literature and are read in a certain way, well read in a certain way, you can't make those connections so you can sort of think through what's going on in the world from an objective standpoint.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We actually are now seeing this retreat on technology. But Bruce, I would say to that, get all my kids connected first, and then we can actually talk about the retreat. There's a great article in the Wall Street Journal where parents in Silicon Valley were saying, we need less technology. And I'm like, can you give us some of that? And then maybe the playing field may be equal. I want to get to you, my brother, but let me just start with this young man because he had his hand up first. Do you still remember your question?
I do.
Stand up. I think we're taping, so we can at least hear it for the camera because I don't think we have microphones.
Sure. It's Roe Gamble. So how do we reconcile, from the fact of Uber and Airbnb that they're not relatively new ideas, right? I mean, if you grew up in New York or even Oakland, you know about Telecom, right? And,
Jitney.
right? Or,
Car services.
you grew up, in the South, you got the Green Book, right? So, I mean, these ideas are, decades old, right? How do we miss out on sort of the economy of that, particularly when, when Uber X went from black car service to the X part, right? Which is essentially illegal in most parts, right? And when we did it, we went to jail.
Want to answer that one, Malcolm?
Yeah, it's funny. I had a conversation with someone in the audience just before we started about marijuana legalization and how marijuana is creating all of these new businesses. And the reality is many people, particularly those of whom are black and brown, have been creating those businesses themselves before it was becoming legal, using the same entrepreneurial skills. In fact, actually under a much more difficult set of circumstances to create wealth for themselves. And so one of the things that I think is really important is we sort of see the thing that is ripe for disruption before it happens. And I think we have a responsibility as a community to be really, really thoughtful about that. What are the things that are not working well, and how can they be improved? And now we are in a place where we are far more empowered than we've ever been to try to come up with those solutions ourselves. Now, there are obviously huge barriers to that, all the things that we've talked about today, access to capital, representation in all of these different places and in this space more generally. But to the degree that we can be innovators and disrupt entities before they even show themselves clearly ripe for disruption, I think there's a huge opportunity to make sure that in the next phase, when the next Airbnb, when the next Uber is created, someone black, someone brown, someone from one of these communities will actually be an owner and not just an employee.
That's right. Let me do rapid fire of questions. Let me go to Michael.
Real quick, the question was, you mentioned Internet of Things, privacy, and 5G.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. With Internet of Things, 5G, I want to look at privacy and GDPR. Do you think we should approach that? That's one. Two, you're Uber, and we talked about data intelligence, and Uber's ride sharing. But in 5 to 10 years, how are you going to address the divide where your drivers will not be driving, it's totally AI? Then going back to the Internet of Things, we're boasting about it, and it scares the heck out of me, because Internet of Things is the biggest problem that I have being in cybersecurity. All these disparate devices connecting together, and you just spoke about privacy.
Right.
And that's an issue for me, but as far as us being connected, we didn't talk about cybersecurity, and that is a big part of telecom space and what you're talking about.
Okay, so let me just break it down because I know some people he's like Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. I know. I was like, Internet of Things actually relates to all the sensors, and it's a connectedness of connected devices. So it is basically the sensors that sit on light poles that talk to another light pole that might talk to a house that might talk to this. It's Alexa, it's voice activated control. Yeah, it is basically the connected world. Like you got your little iPod on, your iPod is talking to something else. But the Internet of Things is interesting because it's not just a consumer thing. It's not just about movies. It actually connects electrical grids, water grids. It could relate to education. There's some Internet of Things devices. I just did a paper on this where you could see if a school bus is coming before it comes. That's the Internet of Things. So it's just I call it a network of connected devices. GDPR is a general data protection rules. Just in May of last year, I think it is, everything's blending in. Europe went ahead and adopted federal privacy legislation that basically says that consumers have to opt in to everything that a provider is asking for. May sound good, but I think going back to Nilda's point, just something about that is, what does that mean in an internet that is so layered? As Nilda said, I might be on Amazon, I might look at Fashion Fair Cosmetics, and then somehow it shows up on my Facebook, and somehow it's now on my Twitter feed, right? Because the internet has become so opaque that it can be difficult. But under Europe, who has a different concept of data than we do in the United States, under Clinton and Gore, we decided to make the internet free. Europe doesn't really care about stuff like that. They think data is something that should be protected by companies, and particularly American companies and consumers. So that's the GDPR, which we're facing right now, should that be precedent, because they beat the United States to the punch. And then AI, artificial intelligence. What that means is the robots have come. That's a simple way of putting it. But artificial intelligence, if any of you remember the Watson under IBM, it is the refinement of computers to not just have the ability to perform a function, but have the cognitive ability and the neural response to understand how that function works. So I'll give you a good example. Don't raise your hand because I don't want to know your business. But how many of you use dating sites? Don't say nothing I don't want to hear. He said, that man back there, he said, I'm using it. He's available, ladies. He's available, right? But under artificial intelligence, just on dating sites, it's not that you are driving the supply and demand. That application picks up cues about your behavior that steers you towards certain people without you even knowing it. That's how smart technology has become. So artificial intelligence refers to algorithms that recommend what movies you should watch on Netflix, even though you're like, oh, dog, how they know I want to see that movie? Because you watched 10 other black movies before, right? It refers you to that picture that you like. How they know? Because they figured it out through artificial intelligence. Automation when it comes to hybrid cars and what machines are able to do. But the bottom line, it has come. So I've defined that for all of you that had deer in the headlight look, because you did have it. I want to just answer this gentleman's question very concisely from the panel. What do we do about privacy? What do we do now that Europe has taken the first step on privacy? Do we still architect our own privacy rules?
I think we need a federal framework for that, because, again, you have to have an expectation that if you're in Milwaukee and you go onto Facebook in Milwaukee, that by the time you get to New York City, there aren't different rules for what you can expect when you go back onto Facebook in New York City. Cybersecurity is a problem. It's a thing. I mean, I personally would just move to an island with no Wi-Fi, but I think it's going to take not, people who don't use the internet the way we do to actually legislate on this thing. If you don't use it and you don't understand, and it's never happened to you, if you've never had your identity stolen, if you've never been catfished, or none of these things have ever happened to you, then you won't understand it. But I would think that the Marriott security breach, like the Facebook security breach, I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg of what has happened, what will happen as we go further down the line. I did not know that, I got a message from Kimpton Hotels. Did you stay there in 2016? Probably. I don't know. I mean, so here it is, 3 years later, I'm getting notices about my credit card being stolen or someone having access to it 3 years ago. Right. So cybersecurity is something that Congress has yet to fix.
That's right. And they just to add on to Nilda on that point, and I want to take the next question. I'll have Bruce answer the next question. Cybersecurity is an issue because it's not just our Marriott account, but it's the Russians hacking our accounts when it comes to elections. That's a cyber issue. We didn't talk about it up here because we're really talking about consumer supply and demand, but it is the topic of conversation in terms of how do you deal with those hacks that not only happen as an individual, but as a citizen of this country. All right, this question right here. She had a question. Oh, okay. No, okay.
I know you just mentioned that you are not dealing with the consumer side, but the reality is that cyber security is big deal now. I want to take a train from Chicago, where I live now, to my daughter in Detroit. Takes 5.5 hours. Japan, a long time ago, has a bullet that goes. I asked them why. Because we have all this technology, but we don't have the money to dig up all the train rails and so forth. The bank, with the dollar bill fluctuating and so forth, it only takes one button to take all your cash and freeze it. So it's good to say all the stuff we're talking about, but with the economy going the way it's going, and we don't have the cash, or if the dollar bill drops, there won't be a run. You can run to the bank all you want. But the reality is that they take one button and freeze it. So what's done, last one is this, cyber technology means that the drones that we were shooting, I was in the military for a while. So Russia now can take that same drone with technology and turn it back around. Or they can take a plane and bring it down. And we're still investing on more missiles and ships. So is there any conversation on what we're doing? It's almost like an oxymoron.
Bruce, you want to take that one?
There's
Yeah.
a lot of activity happening in the cybersecurity space. Actually, here in New York City, there's a major initiative that's a collaboration of a large-scale venture fund, the Economic Development Corporation of the City of New York, Columbia University, LaGuardia College, NYU, focused on cybersecurity to basically make the hub for cybersecurity in New York City, but also to ensure that there's job opportunities across the
Right,
different
which is a big job.
boroughs.
Yep.
So that's one aspect of it. There's also a young brother who's out of Pennsylvania. He's developing drone training programs for young people so that they can learn how to become drone pilots. You can actually get an FAA license as a drone pilot, and there's jobs in that space. So there's a lot of activity going on, but what you're saying is correct in that through this type of hacking of these porous networks, you can actually really get into and control banking. You can do things like turn up the temperature in a factory in Germany so that it blows itself up. So
Right.
all those things are being done.
Right. And I think what you're talking about, and I'm going to wrap it up, but I'm going to take 3 questions. I'm going to do it like you're going to all give me, there's 3 people had the hand up. I don't want to be you're going to give me your questions, and then I'm going to shoot it out to the panel. Whoever wants to answer, and then we're going to wrap it up. Okay, John? So we can just keep it moving because I don't want to be on another person's panel. Time. But I was going to say on the cyber stuff, there's a lot of conversation now on the weaponization of these technology tools, sir. So I think what you're talking about is right. I think we're all having that conversation that while we're having these conversations about consumer and marketplace benefits, that we need to make sure that these networks are resilient and they're safe. And there's tons of conversation happening, the lessons learned from defense, but we have to have more of that because the vulnerabilities can be triggered, in some cases, by a 12-year-old that's just playing around with the network. We've seen cases of
Well,
that.
for every
Exactly.
technology, there's a counter technology,
Exactly.
right? So really and truthfully, it's about being able to be nimble and quick to
That's right.
notify, to have those mechanisms in place that alert, large systems that they've been hacked and
hacked.
breached.
That's
and
right.
all of that.
All right, so I'm going to do 3 questions at one time. So I want you all to put your listening ears on. We're going to start with you, lady, this young lady right here, and this gentleman, and then we're going to wrap up.
Okay. I have 3 questions of my own, but I'll say them real quick. Small towns are really at risk of being technologically disadvantaged. And New York State has a lot of small towns. Are there any New York City like programs for small towns? And what programs do people live in the small towns? Then you talked about the
Now, how many questions you got? You just added it to 6 questions.
technological gap of underfunded schools and schools that don't prioritize technologies. What about homeschool children or the studies that children focus less and people should limit screen time? And then target ads. What is people's real problems with our data being collected? Because I don't mind target ads. I'd rather get an ad for Starbucks if it's something I'm interested in rather than something I'm not interested in.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we'll probably take one of those questions, and the panelists will remain afterwards to actually talk to you, okay?
So the small
Wait.
town-
You gotta follow my, because if I let everybody do it, we're gonna be here for another half hour. This young lady, what was your question? And I'm gonna summarize it for
My
you.
question was just kind of bringing together what we learned about earlier in terms of the wealth gap and how technology and financial services basically are our economy these days. How are you guys thinking about, your companies thinking about or advocating for using
That's right. Okay, got that question.
My question actually is a follow-up to kind of what you were saying. If you look at the job growth in the United States over the last 10 years, most of it has come in the technology industry specifically. A lot of the large technology companies, when you look at the diversity statistics, have been off. There's a lot of cheap diversity hires that have been making all these large companies, but nothing's actually been improved.
That's right.
Where is it? I mean, what really can be done? What's realistic from a 3, 5, 10-year kind of time frame in trying to reduce the disparities in employment?
Okay, perfect. So I think I got all these questions, and I think I'm just going to allocate each of you all a question because I think you all can handle this. So I'm going to give you, Bruce, the question around the education in terms of the New York City, what they're doing in small towns, schools and cities, small towns, and what that looks like. Nelda, I'll give you the wealth question in terms of how can you use technology to leverage wealth opportunities, and particularly in financial sector.
Mr. Glenn answer that.
She didn't want me.
No,
You
no,
didn't
I do want you.
I'm
I'm
also
okay
happy
with
to talk afterwards.
Okay, then I'll
Yeah.
flip it because she knows about the other question on diversity. Well, I'll do that one. Okay, you take the financial and the wealth gap, and then you take the diversity one, and then I'll just finish up with the ads because I got moderator privilege and I get the last word anyway. Okay. All right. So let's start with the New York City schools. If you keep it concise, because again, I want to keep us
So
on
for the
time.
small towns outside of New York City, that's definitely a problem, but there is a $500 million fund that the state has set aside, and I think they're going to try to double it, that's focused on incentivizing incumbents to go into those communities. And it's under, Cuomo.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about the wealth gap.
Yeah, I think the brutal truth, and folks from companies get up at these panels and talk about all the good things our companies are doing. What we don't talk about is all the things that we're doing quite poorly, but we're doing a lot of things quite poorly. And so the brutal truth of many of these companies is, to the gentleman's follow-up question, if we don't have enough of us in those companies, we are not pushing to make sure that we are working with, say, minority-owned businesses anytime we're getting a contract or doing something like that. So, at the beginning of the panel, I said, I think of myself as sort of the internal advocate on behalf of all of communities where we need to be doing a better job. It's a hard job. A lot of people don't listen to me, but I'm going to continue to push forward. But there need to be a lot more of me. There need to be a lot more people, not just who look a certain way, but who are desperately trying to push forward a message about what we need to do at all costs in those companies. And so I think your two questions are very much linked, and perfect segue.
And technology diversity.
Okay, so really quickly, because I think this is important. For tech companies that don't really deal with the public, and I mean deal with the public in a way where every day they walk outside their door, they don't have contact with the public. I think it's a lot harder. This is my own personal opinion. A lot harder for these bigger tech companies to think about diversity in a way that is going to help their company grow, right? Because they've got consumers just coming in, using their products, and moving on. I don't think that they've gotten the message yet, because we're still using their stuff. Even when they do things like getting Facebook dragged up to Congress to talk about how they sold your information to these third-party companies, we still went on Facebook. We're still users of these products. So I think until there's a mass exodus and people are rising up and saying we're not doing it anymore, we're not using it anymore because your products don't reflect us or something like that, it's probably not going to change much. And that's just being honest. I'm not speaking for those companies, but I just, as a consumer, and I'm watching this all, I think that's the problem, right? So that's one. Two, how are we leveraging sort of what is happening in the technology space? I think it's companies like Comcast and Charter and others who have started their own version of incubation, right? They're starting to do their own level of innovative lab processes for companies and young startups that want to do things. Comcast is they built a brand new building in Philadelphia. One of their floors is a whole technology hub center. It's all about innovation. It's all about young startup companies doing things that are creative and will create the next model of whatever it is. But these things are hard. Everybody doesn't get to create a Snapchat and make something out of it. it's hard. It's hard to be disruptive, right? Because you just have to sit there and think. I mean, think of all the things you've thought about you could invent, and you go to look it up, and someone's already done it.
Yeah. Is it okay? Is it? But if it's commentary, you gotta save it till afterwards. It's equipment. Eh.
So just in terms of what you just said there, for example, thinking about Black-owned financial services firms, I cannot imagine what the 401k for Uber is. I can probably imagine there are no minority financial services firms.
Oh yeah.
That kind of stuff. So in terms of not necessarily looking for a disruption, because there are plenty of companies that exist that could definitely use the funds and help our community already. Before we get to the early exposure, there's a parallel track there.
Right.
That's kind of what I was saying.
Well, and I think to your question, because
But the Bruces of the world are doing. I mean, these are the kinds of people who are there. Sorry.
no, not you. I'm telling him no more questions. Y'all gonna get me in trouble. Okay, I'm not trying to get in trouble. But wait. I'm the moderator up here. You gotta let me do what I gotta do. I'm like a preacher. No, just wait. Okay, but I was gonna say, y'all see Steven's looking at me like, never again, Nicole. You used to do good. But listen, I was just gonna say, on the Capitol Hill is actually hosting a hearing on this, so we're actually getting some traction of people seeing the disconnect between the consumption side and the suppliers that are actually servicing these pension funds in addition to that. But I want to say one thing, Bruce, sit down, we ain't done yet. Because you on camera standing up. I'm from New York. We have eyes in the back of our head. But I want to say one thing that is really important that I would like to acknowledge publicly, and then I want to wrap up by answering this young lady's last question on ads. Malcolm is here. I've sat on many panels where they've sent the Chief Diversity Human Resource Officer. Having the ability to have somebody who now is deep on the ground working communities is the pathway that we would like to see. And so as a person who's been around for 25 years doing this stuff, who has asked new emerging companies to come, I don't want to see the HR person. I want to see a Malcolm who's going to connect the services and the products to the people. And so as more companies actually look forward to bring that type of competence to business products and services, they'll understand that diversity works in all angles. I want to just leave with one thing on the ads. Yes, micro-targeting does exist. It exists in the external world and it exists on the online world. When Walmart gave me all the gifts that I had to buy for my children without me having to go in, it was great because I didn't have to actually fight customers. However, micro-targeting is bad when it profiles, when it surveils, when it predicts behavior that's not me, and it's biased. And I would just say to all of you, I have a paper coming out on this, on algorithmic bias. The new civil rights issue today is not necessarily what we see on the lunch counter and what we used to see in terms of what we see now living while black. It is the predictive analytics that happens behind the scenes of the internet that denies you loan applications because of where you live or because they use a zip code. It's the redlining that Malcolm said. And that's the part in terms of civil rights infractions and bias that we need to be concerned about. Those cameras that exist all over New York City and Chicago, when I was growing up, when I was in Chicago for grad school, they said it was public safety, but guess what? It's doing a lot more than that. And so all I'm saying to all of you is, in the ads thing, there's a difference between micro-targeting and micro and macro aggressions that keep communities of color and impoverished communities surveilled. And that's an issue, I think, as we go forward. We want responsible companies like Uber, where the algorithm is essentially the boss of these drivers, to come to our communities and not redline us. We want Airbnbs to rent to us, not deny us because they see our face on the profile. We want judges to not use an algorithm that is based on data that primarily incarcerates people of color, which then leaves us incarcerated longer or detained longer or denied fair bail. That is the reality of what's happening in artificial intelligence and ads, which are run by these algorithms that I think all of us need to pay attention to. On that note, let's give the panelists a big round of applause. Whew. Y'all were tough today, and this is afternoon. Again, thank you for having us. Bishop Steve Smith, please stand up and wave your hand. He is the director of the Telecom, Media and Telecom Project in DC, who is taking these issues on. We are very grateful to the staff and leadership of the Reverend Jesse Jackson at PUSH, who continues to stay front and center when it comes to tech diversity and other issues as we talked about today. Thank you very much, and go on to the next session.